Hey everybody, my name is Charlie Martin and welcome back to another episode of Why Advocate. This is a show where we highlight the works of student advocates and what they're doing to make their communities a better place. Today, I'm sitting with Kerry Yang. Kerry is the AVP of Municipal Affairs with the MSU at McMaster University. Today we are discussing about racial equity and how our own experience with racial discrimination has shaped our advocacy priorities today. Just a little bit of a side note, this is the last episode for the Why Advocate podcast, and I want to say this journey has been amazing. I have learned so much through all the students I've interviewed, and I just can't thank OUSA enough for giving me this opportunity. Thank you. Okay, welcome back everybody. I am now sitting with Kerry. Kerry, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good, thanks. So today we're going to be talking about racial equity, of course. But first, I just want to get to know you a little bit. So for starters, can you talk about your position with MSU and what got you into the role?
Yeah, for sure. So for this coming year, I'm going to be the Associate Vice President of Municipal Affairs, but I also sit on the Student Representative Assembly, which is basically the university version of like Student Council. So I'm the faculty rep for Health Sciences, and I also sit on the University Senate as the faculty rep for Health Sciences. And I first got involved with the MSU a couple of months into my first year, where I saw there was a posting to join the MSU delegation to the OUSA General Assembly. And I initially applied because it was being hosted in my hometown of Sudbury, which is where I am right now. And I was a first year, so I was like really missing home. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to, hitch a drive up. I get to see my parents. But it actually ended up being like a really cool experience where I got to learn more about what student advocacy was like at the university level and get to know like who the board of directors were and other student leaders in the university. So it completely changed like my first year experience, even though at first I just really wanted to go see my parents. So now I'm more involved with the MSU, getting to know like the board of directors for this coming year, and really excited to get into the role of AVP Municipal Affairs.
How has your experience been so far in this role?
Over the summer, it's been really great. I really like the flexibility. I've been able to, be in Sudbury over the summer, which is nice because it's pretty far from Hamilton. So during the school year, I don't get to see home very much. But I've been doing a lot of hybrid work. So just establishing those connections with a municipality. So reaching out to counselors, getting to know the education team and the advocacy team, and just getting ready for the school year has been really great. I think it's a really important part of the role that it starts in April, so you have that transitionary period before you start advocating for students, because before you can advocate for students, you need to know who you're working with, what the needs of the students are, and then sort of just jump in completely once September hits.
Nice. That's really nice to hear that. Like, you're getting into the role comfortably. You have a ample time to get situated with everything. So that's really good to hear. So today we're talking about, of course, racial equity. I just want to ask you first, what got you exposed to racial equity?
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in Northern Ontario, so right now I'm in Sudbury, but when I was a bit younger, I went to elementary school in Thunder Bay. And in a lot of areas in Northern Ontario, it's very predominantly white, and we struggle a lot with diversity, representation, cultural identity. So for me, sort of getting involved, it was just who I was and how I was growing up. It wasn't something I thought about consciously, but it was, it sort of infiltrated like my education. When I went out and started getting part-time jobs, it was just sort of part of the environment that I was in. And it wasn't until, I was in later years in high school where I started realizing how those challenges have affected me and how I've grown up. And it sort of started in this project that I started in my final year of high school. So Pathways to Education was offering up about $20,000 in funding. And they just said, tell us a story and tell us a problem that you really want to fix. And then we'll work together to apply that funding and find a solution. And for me, the experience I thought about and that I think about a lot is when I was in elementary school, my mom used to make these dumplings and then I would bring them to school for my lunch. Dumplings is something that we eat a lot in my culture and also in my family. We eat it during celebrations, but also just during normal times during the year when my mom wants to make the time to make them. And I remember one specific incident when I was in like 3rd or 4th grade, when students are sort of developing more social skills and forming friends, and it's a really hard time for kids while they're growing up, but that also led to students making comments about what other people are eating or how they're being dressed, and saying things like, oh, Kerry, what is that you're eating? Like, it smells really weird, or the texture looks really different. And it's sort of where I originate the first feelings of like shame associated to my culture. So I remember going home and just asking my mom like, oh, I don't really want to bring dumplings to school anymore. I want PB&J sandwiches, which was obviously a very awful experience for her as well as for me. So I sort of told the story of what it's like to be a BIPOC student growing up in Northern Ontario and those little experiences that make you want to erase parts of your identity. And then also the journey of trying to, reconnect with your culture after you've already lost so many years to that sort of resentment and shame. So I just told that story and I ended up getting the funding and being able to work with the local organization. And the first thing I wanted to do was just to explore more experiences of BIPOC youth because I recognized, while, the dumpling experience and having like cultural lunches is something that's shared among a lot of BIPOC youth, there's also more unique experiences that, require conversation, research, and like focus groups to uncover. So first couple of months, we just did a lot of research. We found things like how important representation is in schools. So students, if you want to become a doctor, you want to see yourself represented in that sort of literature and media. And a lot of times we don't get that in Northern Ontario. Like the books and the movies that we see in classrooms are often not representative of, the whole student body. So we just did a lot of research and uncovered the key challenges. And then toward the second half of the year, we got some additional funding from other funders because they wanted us to see how we could address those issues. So just working on this project entirely has put me in a position of like leadership where I'm advocating for students. And it wasn't something that I initially was like, I thought I was applying for. I just wanted to tell my story and I wanted to see how we could fix it for the future generation of BIPOC students. And just sort of unknowingly have been put into this position where I have the privilege to share the stories of other BIPOC youth and then in that experience trying to change the narrative so that, the cultural lunchbox experience doesn't happen for my kids or for the next generation of BIPOC youth. And just doing that in small ways. Like in the past year, we've introduced 11 BIPOC libraries in different schools across the Sudbury region to give that representation to youth and also to support BIPOC authors. We've also given funding to students to lead these small micro projects where we're putting them in a position of leadership so they feel empowered in their cultural identity and they're given the funding to sort of share that empowerment. And then over the summer, we've been doing like cultural art pop-ups, just small things to introduce more diversity and representation into a community that hasn't really had that before.
You brought up one thing about, almost like losing a sense of your identity. And, it's almost like it's a slow process to reconnect to it. What are some ways in which you are reconnecting with your own identity and with your culture and ways that, you're helping other students do that?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, carrying out that project in high school sort of started my journey of like reconnecting with my culture. Like I was aware that I'd lost so much time and I was about to go to university, so that was sort of the first step. But then going to university, I wasn't too sure how my experience with advocacy would translate into that the university scope. I wasn't sure if I would still want to be an advocate because I knew I would be voicing concerns and stories of a different audience. Because obviously post-secondary we have a very diverse student body and the concerns and the challenges that students face are sometimes similar but also very different at times. So I think getting involved at first with the OUSA GA, it was a very low commitment way to just get involved and see what it's like to be a student advocate at the university level. And in that experience, reading over our policy papers, doing those edits and collaborating with other student leaders, for me was really important to see how I could still be an advocate in this space and still bring my concerns and my passions and how I'm passionate about racial equity into that university scope of what student advocacy and student policies within McMaster and also within Ontario universities. And I think a really big piece that I've carried with me for my first year that I was really lucky to have was that I had people to look up to who are women of color in positions of leadership. So at McMaster last year, we had 2 of our VPs were Asian women of color. We had Elizabeth, who was our VP Education, and Sarfina, who was our VP Finance. And right away, I felt like I could turn to them with things that I wanted to talk about. If I wanted to join the MSU in a different way or get more involved, they were the people that I would go to because I felt completely safe talking to them. We shared lived experiences. They were always happy to talk about them. And really soon they became, really close friends, but also really valuable mentors and people that I look up to and still look up to now. And it's something I've never had before, having people that I could look up to in a position of power and a position of leadership who look like me and who are doing a fantastic job and willing to be mentors and sort of lead and pave the way. Because, in Northern Ontario, the problem is that there's this lack of representation where you're forced to be the representation for the next generation. But this was sort of the first time where I had that representation going into a role, and can continue just sort of falling behind in their footsteps and continuing their work. And I also remember later in the year, just following along with OUSA News, Jessica, the previous president, had written this phenomenal blog post. I think it was called like Breaking Glass Ceilings, and she talked about what it was like being an Asian woman in these spaces where she's talking in rooms full of old white guys about politics, and how she has to do everything, like 101% more than the next person just to have her voice heard and just to have the opportunity to tell her story and to advocate for her students. And I just remember it was really empowering to read that article and just to see someone in that position. Jessica doing like an incredible job running OUSA. So overall, I just felt super lucky during my first year that I had these people to look up to. And I know I wouldn't have been in, an AVP position this year if I didn't have the encouragement of those people in my first year.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we did have to stop the podcast for a little bit, but we are back. So, Kerry, I just wanted to ask you, following our last discussion, what are some of the challenges that you face on campus right now when it comes to fighting for racial equity?
Yeah, so I think as a first year student, there's still a lot of things I have to learn about what it is to be a student at McMaster and what the challenges that other students are facing. But in my first year, definitely noticed some parallels between my experience as an advocate back home in Sudbury, and then also becoming a student advocate in Hamilton. And obviously, as students, some of the biggest ones have to do with our academic careers. So when we're in classes, there's often power imbalances between you and your TA or your lab coordinator or even your professor. And that creates uncomfortable environments when you feel like you are being in a position where you're not being respected or there's microaggressions. And as students, it's really hard to speak up because you know that your academic credits or your grades are on the line. So a lot of times we choose not to speak up for ourselves and advocate, which showed me how important it is that there are advocates in this space that are willing to listen to your story, hear your voice, and then advocate for you so that other students won't have to experience the same thing. So that's been a big part of advocacy I've noticed that's different now that I'm in university in a different role than it was back home. But obviously the same things exist everywhere, things like microaggressions, so inherent racism, but also the explicit racism, like students facing hate crimes and acts of hate towards their race, religion, or culture, or whatever it is. So there's obviously a lot of facets to the advocacy in a university role, but I also find myself seeing a lot of parallels in terms of people's stories and their lived experiences, and that makes it sort of easier to connect with other students and then be in a position of advocacy.
Why did you run for a VP role at MAC? What made you want to go into student governance?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things combined. Like I mentioned how I first got involved with student advocacy by going to the OUSA GA, where I sort of dibbled and dabbled and learned about what it was. And when I found out that that's something I was really passionate about, I was able to connect with the previous VPs, Elizabeth and Sarv, who shared my cultural background on top of being amazing women in leadership. So I sort of had that connection and of these two mentors that were amazing and were able to sort of guide me in the right direction of, running for SRA, and then also telling me more about the roles of AVP, and also recognizing that, as a first year student, applying to that position was sort of like an experience for me to learn what it was like to go through an interview, what the position was like, and not something I totally expected to get as an actual role for this coming year. I was hoping that I'd get the experience, so then in later years, I would know how to go through the interview process. So it's definitely a nice surprise to get involved this early, but I also think it's a product of, different advocacy things that I've done in the past in high school and also then in university. And I think the biggest motivator is how my perspective has changed over the past couple of years. So before, when I was back home in Sudbury doing advocacy, the biggest problem to me was always the lack of representation. And trying to find that representation for other youth who are growing up and who want to, see themselves represented in different careers and different positions. But then coming to MAC, already having that representation from other student leaders that look like me was really big in showing that it's okay if you don't have representation because you will find it in other places. And then feeling that motivation of, I definitely can do it because I'm seeing myself represented. And if I continue doing this, I can be the representation for, the next generation of students. So other first years coming in this year or the year after, sort of being that mentor that I had to guide them into different roles in student leadership so that, the whole student community will benefit.
What are some of the policy points that you want to accomplish this year in your role?
Yeah, so a really big one is housing. I just went through, finding a house in Hamilton, which is a really hard process right now, as a lot of students know, probably across all of Ontario. And part of the municipal portfolio is always housing, which I think is really important. But part of housing, I think another important piece is that students feel prepared and comfortable going into, like landlord-tenant negotiations. And historically, a lot of students, when they're balancing, work and school, it's not something that they have time to do. They just want to find a place to live. So education campaigns like that are important, but also sort of just creating like environment in the education team that's welcoming and diverse, and sort of rebuilding different events that have been put on hold during COVID. And this includes things like recognizing like Treaty Week, National Indigenous Peoples Day, celebrating different cultural holidays, so that students coming in from different parts of Canada and even different parts of the world sort of find their community in Hamilton.
So I guess if you were to meet with a first-year student who is thinking about running for a VP role or just becoming a student advocate, what piece of advice would you give to them?
Well, first of all, I would definitely encourage them to go for it. I think as a first-year student, it's really daunting to run for different positions, especially if you're running for election. You're sort of putting your faith into students to, listen to what your platform is and just go for it. But I think it's just that roadblock of realizing that students want to hear from you. They want to vote for the person who's best going to represent them. And that there's so many students that you can find, ways to connect with them, go into classes and things like that. There's always ways to connect with students, whether or not you actually get the position that you're running for. And that even if you're not comfortable running for elected roles, there's so much opportunity in student governance that there will be something for you, whether it's a position that you interview for, whether it's a volunteer role. If you want to get started just by, showing up at the office and having a conversation with some of the VPs and the AVPs, or even joining like a service and doing advocacy with that service where you might have a specific interest. So I think my biggest piece of advice is just that, come and have a chat with me. We can look at what opportunities are available at McMaster, and there's always going to be something for you if advocacy is your passion. And if you have multiple passions, we can find an intersection and you can, commit to all of those within one role. So yeah, just go for it.
Awesome. Well, Kerry, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for being on the show today. And okay. Bye, everyone.